Special thanks to Trains, the leading magazine of railroading, for supporting this video presentation.
There was a time, not so long ago really, when many of life's most vivid memories revolved around the train depot. Families waiting for the familiar sound of the steam engine. And the resounding, unforgettable call of the conductor.
All aboard!
Many folks will tell you it was much more than just a trip to see friends and loved ones. It was an adventure not soon forgotten. During the 1800s and well into the early 1900s, powerful steam locomotives and ornate passenger cars were a way of life. A way of life that is preserved today for future generations to experience at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The National Railroad Museum is one of the oldest and largest museums in the United States, with notable exhibits such as Union Pacific's massive steam locomotive, aptly named Big Boy. General Motors' futuristic-looking Aero Train. The Dwight D. Eisenhower, used by the famous U.S. general to visit troops during World War II. A new reception center showcasing the history of the railroads. And a favorite of young and old alike, a passenger train ride behind the 1923 locomotive, Old 102. All of this is the result of some Green Bay area business leaders who in 1958 drummed up support to put an old steam locomotive in a city park. Since then, more than 1.5 million visitors from all 50 states and 16 foreign countries have taken in the sights. The National Railroad Museum is a subtle history lesson that stimulates the senses of sight, hearing, and touch.
The museum's philosophy is that the railroad had such a broad effect and a broad impact on American culture that almost any historical theme that you can develop around the railroad, whether it's architecture or dining car china or social history through labor unions or improving working conditions, safety, economic history. You can talk about just about all aspects of American life through the railroad. And with that as a philosophy and an operating base, I think we can offer an experience and offer information and an education for hopefully the majority of Americans.
Just this wheel is used to stop the caboose.
You can tell us, play with that a little bit, so we can stop the caboose.
My dad was a boilermaker back in the steam days, and I've always had an interest in railroads, so we're in the Wisconsin, Green Bay area, and we thought we'd drop in and check the museum out. It's beautiful.
I come from a little town in Ohio originally. The reason the town is there because of the railroads. We had a roundhouse. My grandfather was an engineer. My Uncle Ted was. My Uncle Gordon was. It's kind of a step back in time, family-wise for me and my family.
As a boy, I grew up in a railway town, Woodford House, which is of course in England, where my father and both my parents lived. Both my grandfathers also worked on the railway. My interest is also from a photographic standpoint. steam engines, even when they're rusty, in fact probably even more so when they're rusty, they have a certain charisma that comes out with a photograph.
On July 4th, 1961, the National Railroad Museum received the first feather in its cap, and a big one at that, the Union Pacific 4017, one of only 8 big boys. The Big Boy was the largest and heaviest steam locomotive ever produced, and was primarily used to pull long, heavy trains at speeds faster than 70 miles per hour.
Americans, I think, are fascinated with the largest of anything. And so the Big Boy, being the largest steam locomotive in the world, is a fascinating piece of machinery for most of our visitors. To just stand there and look at that massive piece of machinery and imagine it moving down the tracks at 80 miles an hour is just awe-inspiring, I think.
4017 was built in 1941 and logged more than 1 million miles of service before coming to a stop at the museum. Youngsters in particular seem amazed at its size. This Big Boy is 132 feet long and tips the scales at 1.1 million pounds. While the Big Boy may be eye-catching thanks to its size, the Aero Train turns heads because of its looks. The Aero Train was developed by General Motors in the 1950s. This high-speed, lightweight, and eye-catching train was designed to compete with automobiles and airplanes and bring passengers back to the railroad.
Unfortunately, they looked a lot better than they performed, apparently. The cars, which were modified Greyhound bus bodies, were very, very light. The 2 cars were less than half the weight of a standard railroad car, passenger car of the time period. Unfortunately, they were so light that at speeds approaching 100 miles an hour, the reports say they bounced around like a basketball and, quote, practically beat the passengers to death. So from that standpoint, it was not at all successful. The other problem had to do with the technology, which was really a little bit ahead of its time. It had air suspension, it had electrical plug-ins that between the cars that were very complicated. So for a number of reasons, it never really caught on. They make a wonderful contrast, as you noted, between the future of the railroads as they saw it in the 1950s and the past as represented by the steam locomotive number 102.
The National Railroad Museum's experimental Aero Train is one of only 2 ever made. They were used by the Rock Island Line until 1966 for commuter routes in the Chicago area. The museum's McCormick Pavilion houses the Dwight D. Eisenhower, often referred to as a national treasure. This 1937 locomotive was constructed in England and used there during World War II. In 1945, its name was changed to the Eisenhower.
It is very common in England to name locomotives after people. All of the locomotives are named for something. And it was a very great honor to give this locomotive General Eisenhower's name. Whether or not it was actually used to pull the General's train, we're not sure.
2 command cars used by General Eisenhower have also been preserved, giving visitors an almost first-hand feel for what it must have been like for Eisenhower as he rallied the troops.
We talked about the Big Boy, and it's the largest, and that's an attraction. The Aero Train because of its looks. But there is a aura associated with historic things, whether it's a battlefield or a historic house, or in this case, these 2 cars. And there really is a sense of something there. And I think that attracts people, and that makes people understand more about themselves and about how America got to be where it is today.
The not-for-profit National Railroad Museum relies on donations and visitor receipts to fund restoration projects and operations.
The charter for the National Railroad Museum comes from the United States Congress, so we are authorized to use that name from Congress, but that does not provide any financial support. So we operate strictly on our own, on whatever grants and donations we can get from corporations, foundations, individuals, our gate receipts, so obviously admissions are important to us.
Thanks to the generosity of Green Bay area business groups and philanthropic organizations, the museum recently opened a new year-round reception center. The Lenfesti Reception Center is oftentimes a visitor's first and last stop. It includes a large theater for daily showings of multimedia presentations. The exhibit hall features a far-reaching look at the history of railroading. Just outside of the exhibit hall, you'll find the largest gift shop in the Midwest devoted just to the railroad. If you're looking for a gift for a railroad enthusiast, you're sure to find it here. While visitors tend to differ when it comes to their favorite exhibits, all agree that a day at the National Railroad Museum is not complete without a passenger train ride in a 1920s coach pulled by Old 102, a 1923 steam locomotive. For many, it's a ride down memory lane. For others, it's a real eye-opener.
As you can see, this coach is about 80 years old and it's still pulling us along today. Steam locomotives at the railroad. I can direct your attention to the far right. This is locomotive number 24. That's the one that folks for taking the train ride. You guys have been a great group, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day at the National Railroad Museum.
102 is what we politely refer to as a hybrid locomotive. It's a diesel-powered steam locomotive, which takes a little bit of explanation. The locomotive itself was built in 1923 for a logging railroad. In 1988, the museum replaced the original tender with a modified diesel locomotive. And the diesel that looks like a tender actually pushes the rest of the locomotive and pulls the train around the track. It's an inexpensive, very economical way to have the train ride look good without the phenomenal cost of live steam operations. The Chicago Northwestern coach dates from about 1915 and is a very, very, I don't want to say pretty, but very, very period car. In fact, although it was constructed in 1915, it actually gives the sense of being from around the turn of the century and even the 1890s. It was just a car that was constructed to an earlier period. And so it really gives that nice sense of what it was like to travel around the turn of the century. It was hot, dusty, you had to open the windows for ventilation, the converted oil or converted gas lanterns in the ceiling, the wood paneling. Just a very nice atmosphere that way. I hope that it makes people realize that the good old days maybe weren't always the good old days, especially if there's no air conditioning on those cars in the middle of the summer. But that's what it was like. That's realism.
While the view can be breathtaking from the passenger cars, engineer Jeff Truckee must have the best seat.
Sure, it's fun. It's a lot of fun. A lot of people ask or tell me that they wish they had my job. You know, it's fun. Once you get used to it, it's real easy. There's a lot more weight there than you think. You don't feel it, but when you try to slow down, you can feel the weight, and it just takes getting used to it. This isn't your regular run-of-the-mill engine here. One of a kind, really. I like to see them have a good time, and that's what they came here for. And we try to, give them as much information as we can, and let them have a good time and learn something at the same time.
As part of that drive to open as a museum, and again, not just a display of a locomotive in a city park, the American Short Line Railroad Association donated funds to construct the depot. That opened in 1961. Hood, I think his name was Samuel Hood, was the president of the American Short Line Railroad Association at that time, and so the depot was named after him. It's patterned after a depot in Langley, South Carolina, and was new construction in 1961. It's part of the atmosphere we're trying to create. The addition of the brick platform last year, and the whole way we arrive at the station, and the conductor's speech and calling all aboard, absolutely, it really does recreate that atmosphere, that time period, I think, for people.
For children, the museum is a place to run, ride, climb, look, and learn.
I think what fascinates children is the ability to do things, to interact with the equipment. They can go through the cars, they can ride on the train, they can climb all over the small locomotive, they can see things moving. That's a big fascination. I think it's an attraction because we offer parents the ability to interact with their children by means of teaching, pointing things out. Look at this. This is what this does. I think that's very, very important for families.
On the surface, it may seem like a collection of rusty old cars. And massive steam locomotives that have long since lost their desire to pull. But the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin is really a looking glass. Helping us more clearly understand and appreciate our past.
When someone leaves the museum, I hope that two things have happened. Number one, I hope they have had a good time here. They've enjoyed themselves. They've enjoyed what we have to offer. And number two, I hope they take something with them in the form of an experience, either education or emotional, that we've created some kind of a better understanding of how things used to be, why things are the way they are today based on what happened in the past, or just an association because I experienced this as a child or I saw this when I was growing up. So those are the two basic things I hope visitors take away with them when they leave the National Railroad Museum.
The National Railroad Museum. A place to relive cherished memories. And make new ones.
All aboard!